There's a strange thing about human nature. No matter how much we have, it's never quite enough. We chase after money, believing it will bring security. We pursue love, hoping it will fill the hollow places within us. We hunger for praise, power, possessions, each one a promise of something more. And for a fleeting moment when we finally grasp what we longed for, it feels like happiness. But then, the feeling slips away, like water through trembling hands. And so we chase again. A bigger house, a newer phone, a louder applause, a sweeter romance, a higher position, always something, always somewhere, always someday. And perhaps no one ever stops to ask, why are we like this? Why is it that even when life seems full, we feel empty? Why does satisfaction evaporate so quickly, leaving behind a restless heart craving its next fix? It's as though the mind is an eternal beggar. No matter how much you feed it, it keeps asking, what's next? Somewhere deep inside us is a belief that happiness is a destination. That if we collect enough trophies, the perfect job, the perfect partner, the perfect body, the perfect life, we will finally arrive. And everything will be all right. But here's the quiet truth that ancient sages whispered thousands of years ago. The chase is endless, because desire is endless. The Buddha, sitting beneath the Bodhi tree, saw this with piercing clarity. He spoke of it not as a moral failing, but as a natural tendency of the untamed mind. It clings, it craves, it hungers. Not because the world owes us anything, but because we mistakenly believe that what's outside can fix what's inside. And so we become prisoners of our own wanting. Look around. The cities gleam with ambition. Advertisements promise happiness for a price. Social media parades curated moments of false perfection. And everywhere, hearts are quietly breaking under the weight of unmet expectations. We've been conditioned to think happiness is a future event. One that arrives only when we have more, when we look better, when we finally impress the right people. But have you ever noticed, even when you get what you wanted most, it's never enough? That after the glow fades, something inside whispers, what now? It's not your fault. It's the nature of the untrained mind. A mind that mistakes pleasure for peace. A mind that confuses stimulation with serenity. There's a Zen saying, chasing after desire is like drinking salty water. The more you drink, the thirstier you become. The real tragedy isn't that we want things. It's that we believe those things can deliver a lasting happiness. We pour years of our lives into chasing what we think we need, only to arrive at the same conclusion. Happiness was never there. Not in the job, not in the relationship, not in the applause, not even in the perfect sunset. Those things can bring joy, yes. They can stir the heart, color a moment. But they cannot fill the vast, boundless space within you where peace truly lives. That place isn't reached by acquiring, but by releasing, by letting go, by realizing that the greatest freedom comes not from having everything, but from needing nothing. This isn't a call to renounce the world or abandon your dreams. It's an invitation to see through the illusion, to understand that the endless chase is a game the mind plays, and you have the power to step away, to sit quietly, to breathe, to want nothing for a while. And in that moment, to discover a peace so deep it makes every craving feel trivial. They say enlightenment isn't the adding of things to the mind, but the removal of them. Not chasing after more, but realizing you were never lacking to begin with. And perhaps that's where happiness truly waits, in the gentle space between one desire and the next, in the quiet where the mind finally stops asking. It begins so quietly, a thought, a fleeting image, a momentary itch in the heart, and before we even realize it, we're reaching, grasping for something we don't yet have. That's how desire works. It slips in through the cracks of an idle moment, whispering promises of joy just beyond the horizon. A new phone, a warmer embrace, a better version of ourselves, and we believe it because desire is clever. It doesn't announce itself with a warning label. It dresses itself in the language of improvement, fulfillment, and love. It convinces us that what we have isn't quite enough, and what we lack is just one step away from peace. But the ancient masters knew its face. They called it tanha, thirst, an unquenchable craving that lies at the root of all our suffering, not because wanting something is evil, not because ambition is a sin, but because the very nature of desire is restlessness. It keeps us moving, chasing, reaching, always a little dissatisfied with this moment and convinced that the next one will be better. Think about it. When was the last time you were completely content with no thought of what comes next? No inner pull towards something else. No hunger to fix, to improve, to acquire. Those moments are rare because the mind, untamed, is naturally restless. And desire is its fuel. The Buddha saw this clearly. He taught that desire isn't merely a problem because of what it makes us do, it's a problem because of what it takes from us. It steals the present. It robs us of stillness. It convinces us that happiness lives in the future, and that now is simply an obstacle to overcome. Desire is like a fire. Feed it and it burns hotter. Ignore it and it gnaws at you, demanding attention. But observe it, just watch it without judgment, and it begins to lose its power. Because desire cannot survive scrutiny. When you truly see it for what it is, a temporary agitation of the mind, a restless wave upon a vast, still ocean, it starts to dissolve. There's a profound line in Buddhist teachings. Attachment is the origin, the root of suffering. Hence it is the cause of suffering. And what is attachment but desire dressed in the clothes of importance? We cling to people, to things, to status, believing they are essential for our happiness. But nothing in this world lasts. Everything rises, blooms, and fades. When we desire, we tie our peace to something perishable. And so our peace perishes with it. This isn't a call to abandon life or retreat into a cave. It's a call to see. To recognize the way desire moves within us, how it stirs the heart, clouds the mind, and turns the present into a means to an end. To notice how every craving, no matter how noble or trivial, carries within it the seeds of dissatisfaction. The monks in the old forests would watch their own minds like guardians at the gate. They didn't condemn desire, nor did they blindly obey it. They simply observed. And in that simple, honest seeing came freedom, because desire only controls those who believe its promises. Imagine living without that restlessness, not as a lifeless being with no passion, but as someone whose peace isn't threatened by unmet cravings, who can enjoy the beauty of a sunset without needing to capture it, who can love another without trying to possess them, who can succeed in work without being enslaved by ambition. That's not apathy, that's freedom. It's not desire itself that makes us suffer. It's the mistaken belief that our happiness depends upon it. When you start to see desire for what it is, an endless wave of wanting, you realize you don't have to be carried by it. You can step aside. Let the wave rise and fall while you remain still, watching. And in that stillness, something remarkable appears. A peace not tied to outcomes. A happiness that isn't waiting for some future moment to arrive. A contentment that lives quietly beneath the noise of craving. That's the kind of peace no possession can buy, no achievement can guarantee. And it's already here, right now, within you, if only you'll stop chasing long enough to notice. We spend our lives building walls, planning, calculating, securing every angle, as if, by sheer will and strategy, we could wrap the world in our hands and keep it there. It feels good to be in control, to know what comes next, to steer the ship of our fate with steady hands. And for a while it works. We climb, we collect, we organize our lives like a carefully stacked tower of stones. But here's the truth no one wants to say out loud: that tower will fall. Not because you didn't build it well, but because everything in this world is built on impermanence. Control is a beautiful illusion, and like all illusions, it soothes us while quietly betraying us. You get the job, the house, the person you thought you couldn't live without. And for a moment there's relief, a fleeting sense of arrival, but soon enough new uncertainties crawl in. What if I lose it? What if it changes? What if it's not enough? Because it never is. No amount of control can stop life from being what it is: wild, unpredictable, uncontrollable. The tighter we cling, the more fragile our peace becomes. Buddhist teachings often use the metaphor of trying to grasp water with your fist. The harder you squeeze, the faster it slips through your fingers, and the only way to truly hold it is to open your hand. Control is no different. The ancient masters didn't renounce wealth, relationships, or achievements because these things were inherently evil. They let go because they saw how attachment to control turned the mind into a restless prisoner. There's a quiet madness in believing that happiness will come when every part of life finally falls into place, because it never will. Something will always shift, break, or slip away. The people you love will change. Your health will falter. The world will surprise you in ways you didn't ask for. And yet here's the secret most never learn: peace isn't the absence of chaos. It's the refusal to let chaos own you. We chase control because we're afraid of loss, afraid of pain, afraid of not being enough without our titles, our possessions, our carefully crafted identities. But the wisest people I've met weren't the ones with perfect plans. They were the ones who made peace with uncertainty. They understood that control is temporary, and rather than clinging to it like a drowning man to a sinking raft, they learned to float, to let life happen, not in passive surrender but in mindful awareness, in trusting that they could meet whatever arose, joy or sorrow, gain or loss, without breaking. The Buddha called this upekkha, equanimity, a state of unshakable inner balance, not because the world stopped moving, but because the heart no longer depended on its movements. Imagine that. To live your days not weighed down by what might happen next. To hold what you love gently, knowing it may leave. To enjoy success without clinging to it. To love without owning. To fail without crumbling. That kind of freedom isn't bought. It's cultivated. It begins by noticing how desperately the mind wants to control, how it scrambles to predict and grasp and guarantee. And then by gently loosening the grip, one thought at a time, one attachment at a time. It might seem small at first, skipping the urge to argue, letting a plan change without panic, breathing through a moment of uncertainty. But those moments add up, and over time you start to realize the control you thought you needed was never the source of your peace. It was the obstacle. There's a wisdom in letting life unfold. Not because you don't care, but because you finally see that trying to hold it all together is the surest way to come undone. And when you stop needing control, you find something far greater than certainty. You find presence. You find peace. You find yourself not in the future you were racing toward, but in this breath, right here. You finally get what you wanted: the job, the love, the recognition, the number in your bank account. And for a fleeting moment, it feels like everything slows down. You breathe deeper. You smile wider. You think, maybe now I'm enough. But then something strange happens. That feeling, it doesn't stay, it fades. Quicker than you expected. And before long, you're reaching again, wanting again, chasing again. Desire is a clever illusionist. It wears many costumes. It whispers promises that sound like salvation. This one will complete you. That one will finally make you happy. Just one more and you'll be at peace. But every time you reach the horizon, it moves. Like chasing your shadow at sunset. The faster you run, the farther it dances away. In Buddhist teaching, this endless hunger is called tanha, craving, not the natural needs of the body, but the insatiable thirst of the ego. It's the kind of wanting that can never be satisfied, because it's not rooted in what you lack, but in what you believe you lack. It isn't food or shelter or safety. It's the fantasy that happiness lives just beyond your current life. That fulfillment is always one more thing away. And this is the great lie of desire. It never ends. You think you're chasing a goal, but you're really being led in circles, like a donkey following a carrot, suspended just out of reach. No matter how hard you try, you never bite into it, and deep down, you already know this. You felt the emptiness after the high, the silence after the applause, the stillness in the hotel room after the vacation is over. It's in those quiet moments that reality reveals itself. Pleasure is temporary. Possession is fragile. Desire is a fire that feeds on itself. And the more you give it, the more it takes. But here's what they don't teach in school or show in glossy ads. You don't have to keep running. You can step off the wheel, right now. That's what the Buddha saw under the Bodhi tree, that the path to peace wasn't about satisfying every desire. It was about seeing through them, recognizing that desire is not the enemy, but believing it will fulfill you is. Imagine standing in a desert dying of thirst. You see a shimmering lake in the distance. You run toward it with every ounce of strength you have. But it's a mirage, a trick of the mind. That's what unexamined desire does. It keeps us moving but never arriving. And the irony, most of what we chase we don't even want deeply. We want the feeling we think it will bring. We don't crave money, we crave security. We don't crave fame, we crave to be seen. We don't crave the perfect body, we crave to be loved. But those feelings can't be bought. They can't be found in objects or titles or filtered photos. They arise from within, from presence, from stillness, from the absence of craving, not the fulfillment of it. The masters understood this, that chasing shadows would only exhaust the soul, so they chose a different path. Not out of fear, but out of wisdom. They didn't need more, because they realized they already had enough, not everything, but enough. And in that simple realization, they found something that endless desire could never offer: freedom. Not the freedom to have everything, but the freedom from needing everything. A quiet mind, a heart at peace. A life not dictated by the pull of craving, but by the grace of contentment. When you stop chasing what isn't real, you begin to see what is. Not the next goal, not the next purchase, not the next version of yourself, but this moment, this breath, this very life just as it is. And that is more than enough. For most of our lives, we carry an invisible weight. It's not the burden of the world on our shoulders, but the burden of our own mind, the endless conversations in our head, the constant measuring, comparing, wanting, regretting, fearing. And the strangest part is, we get so used to it we don't even realize it's there. We wake up with it, carry it through our days, and fall asleep to its restless whispers. But once in a while something happens. A moment so pure, so simple that the mind falls silent, not because it's forced to, but because, for the first time, it has nothing left to cling to. Maybe it's standing alone by the ocean at dawn, or watching the slow drift of clouds across a wide, open sky, or hearing the laughter of a child so unfiltered, so free, that it reminds you of a self you forgot you were. And in that instant, there's no hunger for more, no thought of past or future, no role to perform, no mask to wear, just this breath, this moment, and for the first time, you taste it, freedom, not the kind stamped on passports or written into declarations, but a deeper kind, the kind that lives in a mind unburdened. The Buddha called it vimutti, liberation, and it doesn't require renouncing your life, your family, or your home. It simply asks for one thing: let go, not of the world but of your attachments to it, not of desires but of believing their fulfillment defines you. It sounds simple, it sounds impossible, and yet it happens. You realize you don't have to grip so tightly. You don't have to control every outcome. You don't have to chase every craving or obey every thought. You can witness them, like clouds drifting across a blue sky, appearing, shifting, dissolving, and you, unchanged. The masters of old were not made of stone. They too felt grief, hunger, joy, and pain, but what made them free was not what they experienced, but how they related to it. They didn't cling, they didn't resist, they let it all move through them, like wind passing through an open window. And in that space, between grasping and pushing away, they found peace. You don't have to wait until you've fixed your life to feel it. You don't have to become someone else somewhere else. Freedom isn't a destination, it's a decision. A willingness in this moment to drop what you've been carrying, the old wounds, the future worries, the endless expectations. And when you do, it's like setting down a heavy bag. You didn't even realize you'd been clutching. You stand taller. You breathe deeper. You remember what it means to be alive. Not in theory, but in direct, undeniable experience. And perhaps for the first time, you understand why the wise smile so easily. Not because life never troubles them, but because they know the storm is always passing, and the sky behind it was never touched. You too can taste this. Not tomorrow, not someday, now, in this breath, in this heartbeat, in the sacred simplicity of letting go, not forever, not perfectly, just for this moment. And as you do, notice the space that opens up inside you, the stillness, the quiet, the ease. That is your birthright. That is what was waiting for you, beneath all the noise and hunger. And once you've felt it, even for a flicker, you'll spend less time chasing shadows and more time living in the light, because what you've been searching for was never out there. It's always been here, waiting. Have you ever wondered why no matter how much you get, it never feels like enough? You reach a milestone, buy the thing you swore would make you happy, hear the words you were desperate for someone to say, and for a brief fleeting moment there's a rush, a flicker of satisfaction, but then almost as quickly it fades, and the mind moves on to the next craving, the next itch, the next unfulfilled wish. It's as if we're chasing mirages in a desert, thinking the next one will finally quench our thirst. But no one ever asks, why are we so thirsty in the first place? The Buddha spoke of this endless cycle as tanha, craving, a restless hunger rooted not in our bodies but in our minds. And behind every craving, if you look closely enough, you'll find the same thing, a belief that something is missing, that this moment isn't quite complete, that you aren't quite enough. We chase money, status, pleasure, approval, knowledge, not because of what they are, but because of what we believe they'll fill. But here's the secret no one tells you: there's nothing to fill that emptiness you feel. It isn't a flaw. It isn't a hole waiting to be patched up by external things. It's the very nature of the mind. And it's beautiful, because when you stop trying to stuff it with temporary distractions, you start to notice something miraculous. The emptiness itself is peaceful, it's open, it's vast, it's free. The sages called this shunyata, emptiness, but not emptiness as in bleakness or meaninglessness, not a void to fear, but an infinite spaciousness, a boundless silent backdrop, against which every thought, emotion, and experience appears and disappears, like waves on an endless ocean. And when you realize this, when you truly see it, something shifts. You stop grasping, because what you were trying to possess was never solid in the first place. That desire for a perfect life, a flawless self, an unbroken string of pleasure, was built on illusions. It was like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. And yet the tragedy isn't in the chasing. It's in the forgetting. Forgetting that you don't need to fix the emptiness. You only need to rest within it. Because within this vast, quiet space, there's no hunger, no fear, no need to become anything more. You simply are, as awareness itself, open, unbound, enough. And in that stillness, desires still come and go, thoughts rise and fall, but you're no longer a prisoner to them. You watch them as clouds passing through a limitless sky, not clinging, not resisting, just witnessing. And the strange, beautiful paradox is this: when you no longer need to chase, life begins to unfold on its own. Joy visits you in the smallest of things, a soft breeze, a kind word, the quiet warmth of sunlight on your face, and you realize that what you were running toward wasn't out there at all. It was this space, this moment, this simple being. The mind's restless craving, it loses its grip, not because you fought it, but because you finally understood it. Desire is not your enemy, it's a messenger. It points to the emptiness within, not to frighten you, but to remind you, you are already whole. And when you can sit in that emptiness, without needing to fill it, without trying to escape it, something extraordinary happens. You meet yourself, not the version the world told you to be, not the one you perform for others, but the vast, quiet awareness that has been watching it all along. And in that meeting, the endless chase dissolves, leaving behind only peace and a lightness you'd long forgotten you were capable of. What if your freedom was never about getting what you want, but about understanding the nature of wanting itself? Maybe, just maybe, the real treasure isn't at the end of the road, but in realizing you never needed to leave home to find it. Let's be honest, most of us don't really want happiness. We want pleasure, and for much of our lives we confuse the two. A burst of laughter at a party, the thrill of a new purchase, the rush when someone praises you. Pleasure is addictive. It's instant. It makes your heart race, your skin tingle, your ego swell. And for a moment, it feels like happiness. But if you've lived long enough, you've noticed the pattern. Pleasure comes with a cost. Every high has its crash. Every rush fades. And the very thing that once excited you soon leaves you empty. A meal you loved eventually becomes ordinary. A person you adored reveals their flaws. A success you obsessed over feels hollow once it's yours. And so the chase begins again. New pleasures, new highs, new distractions, but true happiness, it's something else entirely. It isn't loud. It doesn't clamor for attention. It's quiet, subtle, steady. It's the kind of peace you feel sitting beneath a tree, watching sunlight flicker through the leaves. It's the stillness that wraps around you in the early hours of morning, when the world hasn't fully woken up yet. True happiness doesn't demand anything from you. It asks for no performance, no masks. It isn't conditional on your achievements, your looks, or your possessions. It exists not because of something, but in spite of everything. The sages knew this. The Buddha spoke of it often. He called it sukha, a deep, abiding contentment that isn't born from indulgence, but from freedom. Freedom from needing the moment to be any different than it is. Pleasure is fleeting because it depends on conditions. The right food, the right people, the right weather, the right mood. And when those conditions shift, as they always do, pleasure vanishes. But happiness, true quiet happiness, isn't built on conditions. It's built on understanding. Understanding that everything changes, that no experience, no emotion, no possession lasts. And instead of fearing this, you learn to rest within it. You let the world be what it is. Pleasure says, if only I get this, then I'll be happy. Happiness whispers, I already am. This doesn't mean life becomes dull or gray, quite the opposite. When you no longer chase pleasure as your only source of meaning, you begin to savor simple, quiet moments in a way you never could before. A warm cup of tea, the gentle touch of someone's hand, the way evening light paints the room. Things you might have overlooked now feel alive, vivid, complete, because you're no longer demanding they make you happy. You're simply witnessing them, and in that witnessing, there's peace. Modern life sells us pleasure disguised as happiness. Every advertisement, every app notification, every glossy image. But when you look deeper, when you ask yourself what remains after the thrill fades, that's where you'll find the truth, and it's always the same. Happiness isn't about adding more to your life. It's about needing less, not as deprivation, but as clarity. It's the sweetness of enough, to sit with yourself as you are, to let this moment be as it is, and to realize that peace was never about controlling life. It was about releasing your grip on it. Pleasure will always come and go. It's part of being human, but happiness, the deep, quiet kind, that stays, not because the world becomes perfect, but because you stop expecting it to be. And in that letting go, you find something you were never truly looking for, but always secretly needed, a return to yourself, a homecoming. And somewhere within that quiet space, you might begin to wonder, if happiness doesn't come from chasing the next thing, then where does it live? That question has a secret, and it's waiting for you in the stillness. Have you ever noticed how heavy life feels when you carry too much, not just in your hands, but in your mind? 1,000 silent wants, endless what-ifs, a constant hunger for more. More success, more recognition, more experiences, more things. We live in a world that glorifies accumulation, not just of wealth, but of opinions, followers, memories, and souvenirs. We're taught to measure a life by what we gather, but no one ever tells you how exhausting that weight becomes. Every desire is a stone in your pocket, and most people walk through life, sinking slowly under their invisible burdens. What if the answer was never to carry more, but to carry less, to live lightly, not as a rejection of the world, but as a different way of being inside it? Living lightly isn't about giving up your possessions or abandoning ambition. It's about loosening your grip. It's about no longer tying your worth to the things you own, the titles you wear, or the attention you receive. It's understanding deep in your bones that you came into this world with nothing, and you'll leave it the same way. Everything you're clinging to now is temporary. Every object, every relationship, every moment. And when you stop clinging, when you let desires pass through you like wind through an open window, what's left behind isn't emptiness. It's freedom. The great sages weren't detached because they didn't feel. They felt everything, but they had stopped needing the world to fill the emptiness inside them. They had learned the subtle art of wanting less, not because less is morally superior, but because less is lighter. The mind, by its nature, is restless. It will invent new wants the moment an old one is satisfied, and if you let it lead, you'll forever be chasing. But if you slow down, if you pause and question every craving, you'll realize how many of them are echoes of fear. Fear of being left behind, fear of not being enough, fear of missing out on what might make you happy. When you no longer chase, you begin to see clearly. You notice how simple things carry a sweetness that no luxury can match. The warmth of sunlight on your skin, the sound of rain against your window, a genuine conversation without masks. Living lightly means not needing every situation to go your way. It means not building your peace on the unstable ground of circumstances. It's smiling without a reason, enjoying without attachment, giving without expecting. It's choosing presence over possession. experience over excess. And the irony is, the less you demand from life, the more generous it becomes. Not because you've manipulated the universe, but because your heart is open enough to notice what was always there. The Buddhist masters spoke of simplicity as one of the highest forms of wisdom, not because it's easy, but because it's honest. It strips away the unnecessary. It leaves you face to face with what actually matters, and in that clarity, you discover a peace that pleasure could never offer. The world will continue to sell you more things, more experiences, more versions of yourself to become, but somewhere inside you, there's a quiet voice, the one you've ignored for years, the one that already knows you don't need much to be free, you just need less. And so you begin the art of subtraction, not out of deprivation, but as a return to lightness, one by one. You let go of the stones in your pocket, the need for constant approval, the hunger for status, the obsession with outcomes. And what you're left with is space, and in that space, you finally breathe. And perhaps for the first time in your life, you realize that happiness was never about having it all. It was about carrying so little that you could finally feel the earth beneath your feet, the sky above your head, and the quiet joy of simply being here, alive, unburdened, enough. And as that realization settles, you start to wonder if living lightly feels this free. What happens when the mind wants nothing at all? That mystery waits for you ahead. Somewhere along the long, restless road of human life, we start to suspect something, that maybe, just maybe, this endless chase we've been taught to run was never leading anywhere real. That the moments we feel truly content aren't the ones where we gain something new, but the ones where we quietly stop wanting. Think about it. The greatest peace you've ever felt wasn't during a victory, not while holding a trophy, not while unwrapping a new possession, not while hearing someone praise you. It was in those rare, tender moments when your mind simply rested, when for a flicker of time, it stopped grasping, stopped chasing, stopped comparing, and simply existed. That right there is where happiness lives, not in pleasure, not in excitement, not in the temporary high of fulfilled desires, but in the still, wide-open space. When the mind wants nothing more, it's the simplest thing in the world, yet the rarest, because everything around us is designed to pull us out of it. We're sold 1,000 definitions of happiness: wealth, status, adventure, romance, power, each promise louder than the last. But what no one tells you is that all of those things are impermanent, and even when you have them, the mind will invent new desires to take their place. The root of suffering isn't in lacking what you want, it's in never being done wanting. Ancient Buddhist masters spoke of this restlessness as a fire within the mind, a fire fed by craving, aversion, and ignorance. And it burns quietly and constantly, from the moment we wake to the moment we sleep. But there's a way to let that fire die down, not by forcing it, not by denying it, but by seeing it clearly, by observing how each desire rises, how it seduces the mind, and how, even when fulfilled, it leaves behind only emptiness. And if you watch this process enough times, with calm and honesty, something begins to shift. The cravings lose their grip. The mind no longer leaps at every shiny thing it sees. It starts to settle, like dust in a still room. This is the peaceful mind, not a mind made dull or lifeless, but a mind awake and unburdened. A mind that sees beauty without clinging to it, that tastes sweetness without needing more, that feels joy without fearing its loss. In this stillness, a profound happiness begins to emerge, not the ecstatic rush of a new achievement, but a deep, steady warmth that isn't touched by external events. The world still moves, pleasures and pains still come and go, But the mind no longer rides their waves. It floats steady and silent, on a deeper current beneath them, and you realize the freedom you sought outside yourself was always here, on the other side of wanting. It's the natural state of the mind, when it no longer needs anything to complete it, because it already is whole. The wise have always known this. They understood that every craving was a chain, that each desire, even the noble ones, binds the mind to the cycle of hope and disappointment, and the one who learns to loosen those chains will taste a kind of peace that cannot be given or taken by the world. It's a quiet joy that rises not from gaining more, but from needing less, and ultimately from wanting nothing at all, not because life has become empty, but because it has become enough. And here's the paradox. When the mind no longer craves happiness, it becomes happy. When it no longer grasps at peace, peace appears not as a prize, but as the natural resting state of an untroubled heart. This is what the sages meant when they said, nirvana isn't a place you reach, it's the extinguishing of the fire within. And when that fire fades, what's left isn't darkness, but clear, boundless light, a light you carry within you now, whether you realize it or not. And as we come to the final part of this journey, one last essential question remains. If this peace is always available, if it waits within the still mind, then how do we live it? How do we, in the middle of our noisy, complicated, beautiful lives, carry this quiet light with us? That, my friend, is where we'll go next. And so here we are, at the quiet edge of a long, winding path, a path made of questions you've carried for years, of restless days and sleepless nights, of victories that left you empty, and losses that made you wonder what it's all for. You didn't come here by accident. Somewhere inside you, a quiet voice, the one that whispers beneath the noise of the world, has been calling you home. Home not as a place, but as a state of being, a way of walking through this life, without clutching, without chasing, without needing anything more than this moment, exactly as it is, because you've seen now, haven't you, that every pursuit of happiness outside yourself ends the same way, that desires, no matter how noble, are shadows, and chasing them is like chasing the wind. It isn't wrong to want, it's human, but it's a different kind of life. When you stop letting those wants drive you, when you can sit quietly, in a simple room, with nothing new, nothing to gain, and feel at peace. This isn't about renouncing the world, it's about no longer being ruled by it. Enjoy beauty, but don't cling to it. Experience pleasure, but don't depend on it. Move through both joy and sorrow, like a traveler passing through unfamiliar towns, grateful for what comes, untroubled when it leaves. This is the way of the wise, not because they've acquired more than others, but because they've let go of what never mattered. And in that space, where the endless wanting falls silent, something extraordinary is revealed, not a blinding enlightenment, not a thunderous revelation, but a quiet, steady knowing that everything you've been searching for has always been within you, in the steady breath, in the warmth of the sun on your skin, in the space between thoughts, in the simple act of being. No titles needed, no rituals required, no elaborate philosophies, just this, a mind at ease, a heart unburdened, a life lived lightly. If there's one truth you carry from this journey, let it be this: happiness isn't what you find at the end of the chase. It's what's left when the chase is over. It's the natural state of a mind that no longer wants anything more. And when you discover it for yourself, in your own quiet way, on your own humble path, you'll realize something beautiful, that you were never lost. You were only looking in the wrong direction. The world teaches us to search outward, but wisdom has always pointed inward. And now, you know the way. If this journey spoke to something inside you, if it touched a part of your heart that has longed for this kind of stillness, then you're exactly where you need to be. We invite you to stay with us, to walk further along this path of quiet wisdom. At Zen Buddhism Wisdom, we share more than teachings. We share a way of seeing, a way of living, a way of simply being. If these words resonated with you, we'd be honored if you joined this growing circle of seekers, listeners, and wanderers. Subscribe to this space, not as a follower, but as a fellow traveler. And whenever life grows noisy again, as it surely will, return here. There will always be a quiet place waiting for you.